Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to kind of really try to stay in my lane and talk briefly, I hope, about history. When it comes to thinking historically and what historians do have to offer, we can look for roots and we can help us think about the roots of a conflict in a broader sense. We can help to understand multiple perspectives by tracking this history and seeing where the outlooks are coming from. So to understand both sides, not in any sense to forgive, but simply to understand where they're coming from, to recognize alternatives and especially lost paths, to go back in history and see where paths diverged and the path towards incompatibility, the path towards catastrophe seemed to begin, and especially to look at history to get at least some sense of the limits of what's possible. And that, I think, is an important theme for me, kind of responding to what have been really difficult and understandably angry current discussions, to try to get the focus on solutions and on a sense of where can we go by looking at the past and seeing some previous efforts at understanding. And I do want to make clear that while I'm going to do this ridiculously fast history of the origins of this conflict, that I'm not in any sense trying to do a moral accounting. In fact, in some ways it's the opposite. I'm really, going to mention some awful things, but my job here is not to condemn. My job here is not to weigh, who's more guilty, but really, again, my focus, I think what historians are supposed to do is to try to just understand how we get to where we are and also begin thinking about ways out. So first of all, in my ridiculously short history, I want to go all the way back to the period before nationalism, in a sense, because I do think it's important to understand that this region that is at so much, it's seen so much strife and so much conflict, that once upon a time, it was never free of strife and conflict, but relatively speaking, it was quite a quiet place. And that has a lot to do with the fact that there was a time before nationalism. There was a time before this really essential ideology was dividing people so fundamentally. The region now known as Palestine or Israel was a somewhat neglected, somewhat forgotten area of the Ottoman Empire, a vast multi-ethnic empire centered in Istanbul, mostly governed by Turks, but with many minorities and with very complicated arrangements with these minorities, and it was known administratively as Ottoman Syria, which right away I think is just an important point because it didn't exist. It wasn't Israel and it wasn't Palestine. It didn't have that identity, that definition. And in fact, it was divided up into a bunch of smaller administrative entities that are today mostly forgotten. They were called vilayets and sanjaks. Even if you know the map today pretty well, you probably have a hard time figuring out where things are. Thankfully, Jerusalem is there on the map, but not a whole lot else. So this was a kind of large administrative territory that encompassed lots of very small entities. It was an Arab majority territory. Now, and most of you know this, but Arabs are not Turks. Arab is a different language. It was a diverse religious group, mostly Sunni Muslims, but with a significant Shiite population, with a lot of Christians, with even other minorities. A very small Jewish population, but there was a Jewish population, and it was pretty much a continuous presence of Jews going all the way back to the days when there was a Jewish kingdom in biblical times. Under the Ottomans, there was a growing Jewish minority. There was an influx of people coming from Europe in three major waves of migration. And this was driven largely by a sense of desperation and a sense of opportunity. And in some ways, a sense of idealism. I mean, desperation, opportunity, idealism, all those are squashed together. First, the desperation. Europe's Jews were not in a good place in the 19th century. People often talk about the Holocaust as if it's the Jewish disaster, but in fact, long before the Holocaust, European Jews were feeling extremely vulnerable. They were suffering through pogroms. They were dealing with institutionalized restrictions based on what kind of jobs were they even allowed to hold. In some parts of Europe through the 19th century, they were not allowed to own land. They were not allowed to be farmers. They were not allowed to be state civil servants, certainly not to be soldiers. And so these restrictions, often very humiliating, often very limiting in terms of their life possibilities, created an enormous sense of vulnerability. The idealism that brought Jews already in this period into Palestine was the dream that had always existed, that at some point there would be a return to what they called Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. And so it's easy, I think, and I'm throwing this in because I think our tendency, for a lot of people, is to think about the Jewish connection to this land as being borderline a joke. I mean, it goes way, way back, this Jewish kingdom of Judea, Samaria, that existed for such a brief period of time, and it's so far back in time. And how do these European Jews, or these Jews who live in various parts of the Middle East, there's a huge Jewish population in Algeria and Morocco, in Iraq, in Iran, how do these Jews really feel a serious sense of connection to this little land of Palestine when it's been hundreds of years since they ever had a state? And I do think it's important to realize that that the connection was there. It was there in their religion. It was there in culture. And for many Jews, it did feel like it was like yesterday. The Exodus was something that very much lived on in Jewish culture. And it's not an accident that in one of the most important Jewish holidays, the holiday of Passover, every year at the end, the last words of the Seder are "next year in Jerusalem." Now, what that means in terms of a connection, is open to question. For the Jews that were still living in these tiny communities, they never dreamed of seriously restoring a Jewish state. They simply wanted to be in the Holy Land. And they got along very well with their Arab neighbors, by the way. For the Jews who were coming in, some of them took that dream a little more seriously, that a state was a possible achievement. For some, it was really more, again, about just being in the Holy Land. Everything changes with nationalism. Everything changes with this very specific sense that Jews need their own state. And to have their own state, something that I'll flesh out a little more in a moment, definitely meant that there need to be territories where the Jews are a majority, where they won't feel this sense of vulnerability, where there'll be this intense feeling of security, and more importantly, perhaps even a sense of a future economically, in a full range of occupations, not restricted to any one area, that this could only be guaranteed through a Jewish state. Arabs, increasingly, as we enter the 20th century, have their own sense of nationalism. And a very important turning point for Arabs is World War I, when British secret agents are all over the Middle East, and they're encouraging Arabs to revolt against the Ottoman Empire, to basically join the British-French war with the Ottomans, which was part of the theater of World War I, and encouraging the notion that if they help defeat the Ottomans, then they'll be rewarded with an Arab state. There would be the creation of an Arab nation. And what exactly that would look at, one giant state to be called Arabia, perhaps a few different states. It was a very vague promise, but in many ways that represents the birth of an Arab nationalism as well, the notion that Arabs also need and deserve to be the majority in their own state, and for the sake of protection, for the sake of prosperity, etc. When I give any talk on this topic, I inevitably get asked, what were the Jews thinking though? They're coming in as outsiders. There's this large influx into a land where there's an Arab majority. Did they seriously think that somehow they could come in and create a Jewish state without this leading to civil war? And the answer, importantly, I think, is yeah. Their picture of things was, well, this isn't just about the map that you see there. This is about the larger map. And after all, the Arabs have been promised Arabia. They're going to get this enormous state. And how could they possibly object to a tiny, tiny sliver of land? And the assumption was it would be a pretty tiny sliver that then becomes a Jewish state. And so in this map here, you see the orange areas are Jewish settlement, and it's pathetically small, even within the context of what ultimately becomes the state of Israel. And it presents a very valid question. How could they, for a moment, think that out of this they're going to have a majority Jewish state? But again, the notion was it'll be a constrained, constricted zone, and in fact, historically, relations had been pretty good between the Jewish settlers and the Arabs, and there was an incredibly, in retrospect, incredibly naive assumption that going into the future we can all get along. The conflict starts to brew not only around this abstract idea of nation and who's going to have the nation state here and who's going to be a majority, but also around very specific bread and butter issues like land, like labor. Jews begin to buy up land, and it's important to note that most of the land in this region was owned by absentee landlords. Very often it would be a Turkish landlord somewhere in Damascus, or an Egyptian landlord in Alexandria, or maybe an Arab landlord in Jerusalem, but they had very kind of somewhat uncertain title to these lands. It was often quite complicated. And they had generations of Arabs living, working on the land without worrying, in a sense, about who the owners were. But this was a situation where it was ripe for big investors to come in and be able to buy up large tracts of land. And Jews coming from Europe had the differential wealth and power to be able to snatch up very large tracts of land. And unlike the previous absentee landlords, when the Jews bought up this land, they very often kicked the Arab tenants off. That's the first major source of a brewing conflict in the 20th century over this land. And the second big issue is labor. Because whereas in the 19th century, it hadn't been much of an issue, who's doing the work here? Will it be Arabs? Will it be Jews? And in fact, Jews very often relied on Arabs to do the work because they were much more skilled at agricultural and craft labor. They'd been living on this land. They understood the land. And also because a lot of these Jews, as I mentioned before, were coming from Europe with no clue about farming. I mean, for generations, Jews hadn't been allowed to be farmers. So you didn't tend to have a lot of Jews coming up knowing how to even, plant the fields, what to plant, how to harvest, et cetera. But in the 20th century, that too changes. And with the ideology of nationalism, it's very important to these Jewish settlers that they need to be hiring Jewish labor. That in fact, if Palestine is going to cure the Jews of what ails them, if it's going to make it so that Jews can really, for the first time, become a quote unquote normal people living normal lives in their own normal state, then they have to become farmers. They have to become craftsmen. And there was a very strong push to stop hiring Arab labor in this land that was increasingly being gobbled up by Jewish migrants. And along with the land issue, along with the nationalism issue, that is really the origins of a very violent situation now going in to the 20th century. Racing through history, we get to the question of partition. What are you going to do with this land now? You've got this growing minority of Jews. You've got this increasingly vulnerable and nervous Arab population. And the answer was partition. Now, I want to stay with this for a moment because in today's discussions, there's a kind of incredulity on the part of a lot of American activists that that has to be a two-state solution, that it has to be partition. Why? I mean, we're all Americans who believe in the notion of equality. We believe in the notion of people being able to live together. Why can't it be a single binational state? Why can't, Arabs and Jews live in one state? And if Jews have to live in a state that has an Arab majority, so it is, And if Arabs have to live in a state that with built-in respect for this Jewish minority, so it is. What's wrong with this situation? And I do think it's important, again, to think about this historically and to realize that even back in the 1930s and 1940s, as they were trying to deal with this growing conflict, that they considered exactly this question. And there were plenty of Jews, in fact, who said, why can't we, let's make it a multi-ethnic, single state, democratic, with the Constitution, protections for minorities, et cetera. And there were Arabs most Arabs, in fact, said, of course, this should be a single state with democratic norms and built-in equality. But it's ahistorical to think that at that time, the one-state solution could have won. And it's important to realize how incredibly powerful the notion of nationalism was in pulling people towards the sense that if you're going to be safe, if you're going to be secure, if you can guarantee the prosperity and the safety of your people, you have got to have your own nation state. And Jews didn't invent that idea. That was absolutely at the core of the most important international settlement of the 20th century, which was the Paris peace process of 1919 after World War I. You probably all remember the Versailles Treaty. In fact, that was one of 3 major treaties negotiated at Paris. And that was all about breaking up these old empires. It was all about figuring out where the lines should be for nation states. But the assumption was they needed to be nation states because the only way for Czechs and Slovaks to be sure that they're safe and protected is to be in a Czechoslovak state. The only way for Polish people to feel their aspirations are achieved is in a Polish state, et cetera, down the line. And I think that's very important to shaping the way that this conflict's sense of alternatives evolved. It's also in this same era, in the background, are these so-called solutions to minority problems, to these tensions that existed in various places. And it's not an accident that some of the most infamous solutions were in the context of that Ottoman Empire as it broke up. What is the Ottoman Empire going to do with its minorities? There's a very large Armenian minority. And I think most of you know how that turned out. The solution to the Armenian question turned out to be genocide. There was also an enormous Christian population in the Anatolian province, largely Greek. And with the emergence of a Greek state, there was this sense, not just in Turkey, not just in this region, but worldwide, that to solve the tensions between Greeks and Turks, the best answer was to actually exchange population. And so in one of the most bizarre moments, I think, in international law, in 1923, there was a worldwide consensus, in a sense, of major powers at least, that pulling 1.3 million Greeks out of Turkey and sending them to Greece, a country where most of them had never been, had no direct sense of connection, but sending them to Greece was a way to solve their minority problem, while the Muslims in Greece, of whom there were, I think, 300 or 400,000, would then be sent to Turkey. So this is what's in the air as people are trying to deal with a solution to this growing conflict between Jews and Arabs. And I think that's really important to giving that sense that the best way to get out of this is with 2 states, not 1 state. That 1 state is it's just going to lead to more conflict. It's just going to cause this to spiral. Now it's going to speed up even more because I want to get to Leila. You should definitely know that in 1948 there was a partition, and in 1948 there was an absolute disaster, which was the Jews immediately taking up arms, feeling that they were surrounded and about to be invaded by the other Arab powers, and immediately, in many cases, at the point of a gun, forcing out large sections of the Palestinian population. This is the beginning of the Palestinian refugee crisis. It's remembered by Palestinians as the Nakba, the catastrophe, whereas the same moment is remembered by Jews as this kind of glorious beginning of the state of Israel, the final, the rebirth of a Jewish state in Palestine. 1967, a date you should know about, when Israel fights another war with its Arab neighbors and takes over one big chunk of Palestine that they didn't get in 1948, which is the West Bank, and another smaller chunk, which is this Gaza Strip. And since that time, we've had plans for a solution that would hopefully be more humane, not anything as monstrous as those solutions we talked about in the early 20th century, one that can lead to a lasting peace. The Camp David Accords of 1978 are important to note. It's also important to note that they happened without the participation of the Palestinians, over the heads of the Palestinians, that you had an Egyptian leader and an Israeli leader coming together with Jimmy Carter, the American president, and trying to come up with their own solution that basically ignored for a moment the entire issue of the Palestinians. That situation changes dramatically in 1993 with the Oslo Accords, when, for the first time, the state of Israel actually recognized the Palestinian Liberation Organization as legitimate representatives of the Palestinian people, and for the first time seemed, although the language was a little convoluted, seemed to be recognizing the national aspirations, not just of Arabs, not just the Arab people, but the Palestinian people, to actually recognize these inhabitants of this land as having their own valid national goals. And then finally, and I think most controversially, there's the plans of 2000, the Camp David Accords back at Camp David, and that was a very conscious choice to go back to Camp David, this time with the Israeli leader Ehud Barak and the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat. And this seems to have been a moment where Barak, and it's unclear how much power he really had as his moment as prime minister, but Barak was actually acknowledging a Palestinian state as a goal. And that going back to the dream of partition, that with the West Bank and Gaza, that we can come up with the basis for a Palestinian state. Now, on the Palestinian side, there were two gigantic questions. One was, what about Jerusalem? And Barak basically said, we don't want to talk about that now. That's you'll get me killed, like my predecessor who was assassinated. I can't talk about Jerusalem. And the other big question was, what about all the Palestinians living in exile and their right of return? Just as the Jews have the right to go to Israel, what about the Palestinians' right to come back to this Palestine? And there again, Barak was like, can't talk about that. Everything blows up in the mid-2000s with no solution having been found, with these plans largely having been shelved, in an uprising of Arabs that's remembered as the Second Intifada. Israel is pushed to just simply withdraw unilaterally from one of these occupied territories, the Gaza Strip. And in 2006, 2007, Hamas, an organization that is much more radical than the previous Palestinian entity we talked about, the PLO, much more dedicated explicitly to the destruction of the state of Israel, Hamas takes over in the Gaza Strip, leading to a blockade, which I'm sure you guys know about, largely, but not exclusively, driven by Israel. I think it is important to note, it gets easily forgotten, that while Israel is mainly behind this blockade, the Egyptians have been complicit in keeping the Rafah border closed, and even the Palestinian organization that governs in the West Bank at various points has even been supportive of this blockade. So the blockade it's a horrific reality that has turned Gaza into an open-air prison, that's led to incredible human rights abuses, and the main burden is definitely on the state of Israel, but it is important to note too that there's a great deal of complicity here, and a lot of that has to do with the animosity towards Hamas. And since then, we've been in an era of, we could really call it the era of no plans. The Palestinian Authority in the West Bank has been in crisis. Hamas has been strangely quiet. was strangely quiet until October 7th of the previous year. Israel became dominated by the far right, which is where they are now, with a government that's absolutely disinterested in any kind of negotiation, at least for the moment. And the Israeli policy literally became mowing the grass, as they called it, which is a really grotesque term that the Israeli military used for the idea that every once in a while we're simply going to have to go in and kind of chop off heads and reduce the military threat of these regions. But of course, that's not really a plan. That's barely even a policy. That's just an incredibly cynical response to what they thought would be a way to guarantee Israeli security. And I think that's about as well as I can do in kind of giving this, again, race through history, getting us to the point where we face an absolute humanitarian catastrophe already, more than 27,000 people dead, and a looming, kind of almost unimaginable idea that the Israelis are going to push even farther south to the border, crossing with Egypt, where currently there are something like 1 million refugees gathered. And it's again a kind of policy in the absence of a real policy, certainly the policy in the absence of a plan. Thank you.
Warren, that was just fantastic. And it's your disclaimer about historians feeling that they're not very good at explaining current conflicts. Lawyers don't feel like they're very good at dealing with history. So I really appreciate your kind of sort of very quickly covering 2,000 years of history and sort of setting up where we are now. So a couple disclaimers. I have worked for the International Criminal Court for a long time, and I also worked with the International Court of Justice. I've been an international lawyer for more than 30 years, doing commercial cases, civil cases, criminal cases, and interstate cases. So I look at things very differently than an historian. I'm of mixed heritage, so I should just put that out there. My distant relation is Anwar Sadat, and my mom was Jewish, and I grew up in the United States as a Christian. So I basically am completely confused about who I am, but have some connection actually to the conflict in a very profound way. And so I always say that because I feel like you should know, who's talking to you. That said, I really believe in international law. I have a little pin. This is the United Nations Dove of Peace. I spent a lot of time in the United Nations. And I really believe in peace, human rights, and justice as the core of what we're supposed to be doing on this earth, no matter what faith you come from or who you are as a human being. And I also say in all of my speaking to my students, there's no team A here and team B, there's team humanity. And that's really the rule that we're supposed to be enforcing as an international lawyer. So like Warren, I will try to simplify a very complex subject for you, and I'm really open to questions. So many people think of this as a religious conflict. I think of it as a property dispute. And why do I say it's a property dispute? I feel like the presentation you just heard tees you up for understanding why it's actually a property dispute. It's about a piece of land and who gets to live there and how they get to live there or not. And so as a lawyer, I think of it as a piece of property that two sides, and actually multiple sides, are arguing about. And so the partition plan, which you heard about, proposed a subdivision, essentially, of the land into two states. I also think that the unwillingness of both sides to accept the resolution, even though one can argue that the resolution was the wrong solution, that it was a nationalist solution, that it teed us up for the conflict that followed. I agree, actually, with Dr. Rosenblum. There were lots of other options on the table, but that wasn't the option chosen. And I'll tell you why I think the partition was. It's had devastating consequences for Israel, for Palestine, for the soul of both states, and really for the international community writ large. And the most recent conflict, I think, represents the most serious departure from the UN Charter since the 48 partition, which is why lots of courts are involved and lots of lawyers are involved. And I'm going to teach my international law class tomorrow. And tomorrow we're going to look at the Iran hostages case. And that was also a hostage-taking crisis. Lots of courts were involved. Lots of lawyers were involved. And you won't believe it, the U.S. Iran Claims Tribunal in The Hague is still sitting adjudicating some of the claims out of the 1979 hostage crisis. And we can talk a little bit about how law helps, hurts, doesn't, but I do think it gives us a set of standards that all have to comply with and a certain degree of neutrality and rules that helps us wind our way through these. When I say that this represents, I think, one of the most serious threats to the UN Charter system since the Charter was adopted in 1946. I say that very sincerely. We just saw a third veto by the United States of America this morning of a ceasefire resolution. This reminds me of Russia's continual vetoes of resolutions in the Syria conflicts. We have complete dysfunction at the Security Council, which is entrusted with the maintenance of international peace and security. And in my view, and I'll just say this, even though I'm being recorded, it represents an abject policy failure by the United States to manage to find a resolution and a compromise that would allow the Security Council to function, because that is its job. And as one of the permanent members of the Security Council, the United States can't point its finger and wag it at Russia if the United States isn't willing to do the heavy lifting as well. So we can come back to that. But this threat, this war in Gaza, like the war in Ukraine, represents a really existential threat to the international legal order created in the ashes of World War II. I like maps because it's a property dispute. This is on the left, the partition. You can see that the land that they thought about in 1948 would have given more to Palestine than the current maps do. Jerusalem is in white. Jerusalem is intended to be an international city under international administration. Any of you who like Karen Armstrong's work, any of you who think about religion, know that there are three faiths that look to Jerusalem as their home, not just Israel, but also the Muslims and Christians. And it was hard not to be moved as well by the Christians in Bethlehem this year, putting that photo of the baby in the rubble in the manger to show that there are not just one faith, there are three faiths that are at least involved in this. And that's why I say it really isn't a religious war. It's been mischaracterized as such. It really is a territorial dispute. The right is a map from the International Court of Justice, which was asked to adjudicate a question about the wall that Israel built during the Second Intifada to protect parts of its territory. And the argument at that case that the General Assembly put to the International Court of Justice was, did this separation barrier between Israel and the West Bank, did it violate international law by basically de facto annexing part of the territory that had been set aside for the Palestinian state? So we can come back to that. This is, again, another version of the map. You can see it a little better. On the right, I put the Kushner plan. So to the extent that we've seen this sort of slow motion train wreck, which exploded on October 7th happening, it hasn't come out of a vacuum. That doesn't excuse what happens, right? Atrocities are atrocities. The law applies to all equally. But nonetheless, the Kushner plan definitely roiled Palestinians in Palestine because it shows even less property being allocated, even more settlements, even less of a role for the Palestinian Authority. And I might talk about that because one of the things that changed in 2012 is Palestine was voted non-member state status in the UN General Assembly. And so when we think of the nationalism part of this, there are now actually two states. Palestine isn't recognized by Israel, but it's recognized by about 140 other countries and by the UN General Assembly. So it can bring its own litigation. It can do things that it couldn't do before it was granted statehood. This is, I think, one of the precursors to October 7th. Again, no excuses for October 7th, but it's something that's really come out of the litigation that's ongoing right now, which is Prime Minister Netanyahu actually presents to the General Assembly a map of the new Middle East, which doesn't show any space for Palestine. It's just Israel on the map. And it was presented to the General Assembly. And you can have my slides afterwards. I like to put links on them in case you want to look them up. But I think this was one of the things that told those of us who work in international law, right, this is getting worse, not better, because this is obviously a very, it's inconsistent, with 70 some years of UN General Assembly and Security Council resolutions. So what happens? October 7th, I don't need to go into it, but we've seen about 1,200 killed, about 600 to 700 of those were civilians. It was a terrible attack involving the commission of atrocities by what we call a non-state actor, meaning it's not a state. Hamas is a non-state actor. The state authority of Palestine is the West Bank Authority. That's what's hold the seats in the United Nations General Assembly. It's the Palestinian Authority that goes to Geneva or to The Hague in order to litigate these cases. There are two courts. Sorry, that was the best picture. I did the PowerPoint fast. That's me on the left in front of the ICC with all our former war crimes ambassadors at the time. And this is the International Criminal Court. You can see it's surrounded by a moat. I just had somebody describe it as it's the building that looks like it's covered with bathroom tiles. I think that's very unkind, but it is definitely austere, right? It's a criminal court. We try war criminals at the ICC. And the other court that's involved now is the Peace Palace in The Hague. And the reason I'm bringing the courts in is those of you following the news know that there are two big cases ongoing right now. One is a contentious case, and the ICC has been involved. So I thought maybe I would spend a little time just explaining what these courts are, what they do, and what this case is. I can't solve the Israel-Palestine crisis for you, but I can tell you at least what the courts are going to do. The ICC, and I put them on the left, it has 124 states parties. It's not a United Nations organ. It's set up by a separate treaty, and states have to join the treaty in order to participate in the court. What does it mean to participate? You have to pay dues, and you can elect a judge. Your nationals can become staff members at the court. Palestine has joined the court. Why? Because when it became a state, the UN Secretary General said it could deposit its instrument of accession to the International Criminal Court. It is a state party. Israel is not a state party. Israel has not joined the ICC. The court with the nice building, the Peace Palace, the ICJ, Israel, Palestine, well, Israel is a party to that because all member states of the United Nations are. Palestine can't join it in the same way because it can't join the UN because the Security Council will block it. The US will veto its application. You have to be admitted by both the General Assembly and the Security Council, and it can't get past the Security Council. But Palestine, through another provision of the court statute, can still be represented in front of the International Court of Justice. It can bring cases. It has, in fact, brought a case against the United States for moving the embassy to Jerusalem, which Palestine says is disputed territory per the 1947 partition. Right now, today, there is an ongoing proceeding under the advisory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, where the legal consequences of Israel's annexation of Palestinian territory are being examined. You can look at the statements. It starts at 3 o'clock in the morning, our time. So I don't typically wake up for ICJ arguments at 3 a.m., although sometimes I do because I am that much of an international law geek. I've just put on the slide Palestine's opening statement. 54 states and organizations are scheduled to appear, although Canada just announced it's not going to plead. It did submit a written statement. You can also see on the ICJ's website all the written statements that have been submitted by a variety of states, some in support of the application. Israel has submitted a statement. The United States has submitted a statement. You can actually just go and read them. They're all publicly available on the court's website. At the International Criminal Court, you might have seen a CNN broadcast, I think Sunday night, where some family members of the hostages who were taken by Hamas have flown to The Hague to go give a brief to the International Criminal Court to ask the ICC to investigate the crimes committed on October 7th. That's tricky. I don't know if they were supported by Israel because Israel does not recognize the jurisdiction of the ICC. And the difficulty is, were Israel to recognize its jurisdiction, all Israeli activities are also subjected to the jurisdiction of the ICC. Right now, because the ICC can exercise jurisdiction over the territory of states parties or their nationals, it is true that Hamas's actions can be looked at by the ICC because they're Palestinian nationals and Palestine has accepted the ICC's jurisdiction. But all investigation would be on Israeli territory, presumably, because that's where the crimes have taken place. And so that raises a very tricky issue. So I'm not sure if the families are actually supported by the state or not, but obviously they're looking to the ICC for some sort of relief. More to the point, the ICC establishes individual guilt. It does not adjudicate on the responsibility of states. That goes all the way back to the Nuremberg trials. If you remember, the Nazis were tried at Nuremberg for crimes committed during World War II, including the Holocaust, although that was a minor part of the proceeding. And the idea was to fix in a way the error of Versailles by not condemning the entire state to pay reparations, but focusing on the individual criminal culpability of those who led the state into the war, who actually committed. We call it those most responsible. It's a leadership crime. So even in the current conflict, if you think of the International Criminal Court, normally it wouldn't be the low-level operative who crossed the border who committed something, or the individual Israeli soldier who shot somebody or committed a crime in Gaza. It would be the leadership that would normally be the target of the ICC. The ICC's indicted Vladimir Putin. It's indicted President Omar al-Bashir, former President Omar al-Bashir of Sudan. It's true there are lower ranking accused that will be indicted and have been indicted by the International Criminal Court. But overall, because it takes very few cases and it's a world court, it doesn't focus on sort of the quotidien atrocities, the daily atrocities. It focuses on the planners, on the instigators, on those who put in motion the criminal plan. And that's what the Nuremberg Tribunal did after World War II, and that's what the Yugoslavia Tribunal did when it prosecuted the crimes coming out of the Bosnia versus Serbia, out of the Bosnian War in the 1990s. Proceedings are lengthy at the ICC. The ICC is not a quick fix for anything, and cases have to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, which is an extremely high standard. Jurisdiction can be triggered by state parties. It can be triggered by the prosecutor proprio motu or by the Security Council. Israel cannot trigger the jurisdiction of the ICC. It's not a state party to the court. Does that make sense? So Palestine can, and Palestine has, meaning that also Palestine has said, ICC, you can investigate anything that happened on our territory. We agree not to commit genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes. Israel has not agreed to that, but those crimes are codified in customary international law. Okay, this is the second court. This is the other court, right? It gets confusing. This court does hear cases against states. So this court, but it doesn't put anybody in jail. It's not criminal responsibility. It's civil responsibility. It's responsibility. And there are two cases right now, not the embassy case, which is different, but South Africa has brought a case accusing Israel of genocide. You probably heard about that in the news, and I can answer questions about that if you want. It's using, states can only be brought before the ICJ with their consent. They're all parties to the statute, but they have to consent to cases. So it has the ICC has a more compulsory jurisdiction, we call it. You ratify the treaty, you're under the court's jurisdiction. You can be accused of those crimes. The ICJ, a state has to ratify the UN Charter and agree to the bringing of the case. So how did Israel agree to being brought before the ICJ? It ratified the Genocide Convention. And the Genocide Convention, let me see, I'll just fast forward, has a clause, Article 9, that says, in the case of disputes regarding interpretation, application, or fulfillment of the convention, states can go to the ICJ for adjudication, right? They can solve their disputes by going to the International Court of Justice. South Africa is a party to the Genocide Convention. Israel is a party to the Genocide Convention. And based on Article 9 of the treaty, South Africa has been able to bring that case to the International Court of Justice. And I'll come back a little bit to, but I won't talk much about the merits, okay? And that's the second one. So let me talk about this. So genocide is a term that's being bandied about a lot. Genocide is, and in some ways, it's because we don't have a Crimes Against Humanity Convention, and the Geneva Conventions don't have a dispute resolution clause allowing for jurisdiction in the same way. So when South Africa says, I want to bring a case, I'm upset about what's happening in Gaza, the only treaty they have is the Genocide Convention. There's not a Crimes Against Humanity treaty, and Israel's not going to consent to a case being brought unless there's a treaty already in force, right? So they're sort of stuck with trying to fit what happened. There's no doubt that the Palestinians constitute a group. The convention protects groups, not individuals. It protects only 4 groups: national, racial, religious, and ethnic. It doesn't protect social and political groups. It doesn't protect cultural groups. It didn't protect Cambodians in the Cambodian genocide, which is popularly understood as a genocide. In this case, the Palestinians are a group, and the argument of South Africa is that there is an intent to destroy them, as evidenced by some of the intemperate language that we've heard from Israeli leaders, and that some of the Article 2 acts have been committed. The convention prohibits attempt, complicity, conspiracy, direct and public incitement, and commission. It's a criminal law treaty, normally used in the criminal law sense, very high bar, lots of acquittals on genocide counts when they have been used in criminal cases. The first successful criminal case for genocide was used in the Rwandan genocide by the Rwanda Tribunal in 1994. The treaty, right? It's a 1948 convention. The first time we ever see it used is 50 years later, 1998. So this is South Africa's case, okay? Very, very difficult. I just want to come back to this, and I can answer questions, a lot of detail here. One of the things that's confusing is both the ICC and the ICJ hear genocide cases, but one is a civil case, one is a criminal case. Very, very different. The advisory opinion that's ongoing right now has nothing to do with genocide, although Palestine brought what was happening in Gaza into its pleadings. That case was started well over a year ago. Had October 7th not happened, I think it would be a very different case. It's obviously coming across very differently now in the wake of what's happening, especially in the siege that was declared since October 7th. The United Nations system is designed to promote peace, human rights, justice, and security. Even though there are religious claims to land that lurk in Israel and Palestine, even though there are historical claims to land that lurk, basically the title granted to Israel in particular is the title of the partition. It's the 1947 resolution voted by the General Assembly that created. If you listen to Palestine's statement before the ICJ yesterday, the West Bank Authority has said, we accept the two-state solution based on the 1967 borders. Israel is now saying it does not accept the two-state solution at all. So we have a crisis really to the whole United Nations system. And when you think about why is the United Nations so involved in this, it's because in a way, Colin Powell used to call it the Pottery Barn theory. You break it, you own it. The United Nations, having created the situation we have on the ground in Israel and Palestine through the partition, the United Nations retains responsibility both through its refugee agency that has provided food, shelter, education, hospitals, and everything else to Palestinian refugees since the Nakba, since 1948, and in terms of bringing a resolution to the conflict. One of the things I tell my students who get very discouraged right now between the war in Ukraine, we haven't even talked about the war in Sudan, which is a crisis of unbelievable proportions, getting no airtime because Gaza and Ukraine have completely taken our perspective. So it's really easy to be discouraged. And I love this quote from Dag Hammarskjöld. He was killed on mission for the United Nations in its very early days. He was one of the first secretary generals of the United Nations. And he said, look, the point of this is not to create heaven, but basically to save us from hell. And I do think that rather than attacking the United Nations system, I really hope that the United States, as a permanent member of the Security Council, one of the most influential members of the United Nations, always had a judge on the International Court of Justice, can really play a constructive role in helping the organization fulfill its objectives in this very critical time for these people who are just suffering a tremendous amount. So I think I'm going to stop there just with one more photo. I worked in Paris as a commercial lawyer for about 5 years, and I used to walk by UNESCO headquarters. This beautiful square, this is an olive tree. It's much bigger than when I used to work in Paris, which it had just been planted. And this is a square of tolerance that was a tribute to Yitzhak Rabin, the one who got assassinated because he tried to actually make peace. It's a beautiful line from the UNESCO Constitution. Since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace have to be constructed. And I think that goes to Professor Rosenblum's beautiful presentation, which is, I'm the lawyer. I can tell you what the rules are, what the CAD is, what the framework is in which everybody's supposed to be operating. But essentially, you have to win the hearts and minds. You have to get people to be able to accept the solution at a deep cultural and even visceral level in order to bring about peace. And that is the job of education, which is why I'm really grateful to Webster University to being brave enough to even touch this subject, given that presidents of universities have been fired for giving wrong answers in discussing it. So anyway, thank you so much for your kind attention.